O Canada, our home and native land built on Indigenous land. Even for those of us who have spent the bulk of our educational lives in this country, this might not be something we stop to think about too often. Now, I urge everyone watching this to take a moment to reflect on the land that you are currently living on. I personally reside on the Halamont Tract, which is the unceded territory and ancestral land of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Neutral people. This is land that was promised to the Six Nations, encompassing 6 miles on either side of the Grand River. Now, this issue is far from simple, but to summarize, when European settlers arrived in Canada centuries ago, they put everything in their power towards molding this country into everything they wanted it to be. And this included the cultural assimilation of the Indigenous people to whom this land so rightfully continues to belong to. Now, you've probably heard of or learned about residential schools, how they contributed to this process, and the horrific effects they had on thousands of Indigenous families across the country. Residential schools were established by Christian churches in conjunction with the Canadian government to try to remove Indigenous culture from the Indigenous people through physically and emotionally indescribable conditions. And the scary part is that it worked, because what most fail to realize is that even though Canada's last residential school closed a few decades ago, the aftermath of this terrible time period continues to prove itself existing to this day. Now, when trauma from a certain event or series of events is passed down from one generation to another, it becomes intergenerational. And this means that even though residential schools don't physically exist anymore, the results of their aftermath are most definitely still around today. Through my research of this topic, there was one question in particular that helped me guide my research, and that was, in what ways are the intergenerational impacts of residential schools still around today? I've gathered some sources with information that best helps me answer this question. This includes 2 primary sources and 3 secondary sources. My first primary source is an interview with Louise Longclaws, who is a residential school survivor, who so kindly and bravely chose to share parts of her story through an interview with CBC. She speaks about how her experiences at residential school had actually extended long past her childhood and began to hinder the way she raised her own children in the future. And as heartbreaking as this is, it's even more sad that this isn't too surprising or out of the ordinary. It does make sense. If a person grows up being taken away from their family, how will they know how to raise a family of their own? In this context, the forceful removal of Indigenous children from their homes erased the knowledge of a healthy family life from much of its survivors. But it does go further than that too. It creates this cycle of generations upon generations who may not have a full grasp of not only healthy family life, but their cultures too. In her interview, Louise mentioned that her mother had deliberately chosen not to teach her the Ojibwe language as a means of protecting her daughter from being caught by the people running the residential schools, just like she was as a child. The danger in this is that once a culture fades away, it is extremely difficult, if not entirely impossible, to bring back. Once it's gone, and it's not enough just to acknowledge this, because everyone must actively contribute to the support and preservation of Indigenous cultures and ways of knowing, because they are way too valuable to risk losing. Now, this source really stuck out to me, and I just found so much value in Louise Longclaws' words. I feel like, especially with this topic, interviews are essential sources to study, as nobody knows more about an issue than the ones it affected. To further prove the significance of this interview, I'm going to pass it through the CRAAP test. Starting with C for currency. The video account of this interview was posted on March 19th, 2018, which is just under 3 years ago. Since it's a video, there isn't much that can be done regarding its updating or revision per se. However, this is in no way a hindrance to the validity of this source. Lived experiences will remain lived experiences forever, and no amount of time or no passing of events will change their significance. Louise Longclaws was herself a residential school survivor. Her words will never expire as her experiences are locked into history. Therefore, this source is a valid currency. Moving on to our relevance. Clearly, this information relates directly to my topic of Indigenous intergenerational trauma, as it's a recount of first-hand experiences. I did look at quite a few other interviews before this one, but I do feel as though Louise's interview does the best job at clearly capturing the issue and sharing her experiences with it. Now A for authority. The publisher of this video is CBC News, a highly respected news broadcasting service with a very trusted and well-established base. The value of this publishing, however, lies directly in Louise's words. Thus, when you take into account the established reputation of CBC and the validity of Louise Longclaws' experiences, it is 100% an authorized source. On to the next A for accuracy. As I mentioned a few times earlier, this is a direct first-person recount of experiences. There is no information that could be more truthful than this. In addition, a lot of the information from this source is evident in other sources as well. I took an Indigenous Studies course at my school last semester, and the themes discussed by Louise correlate directly with the ones I learned about in class. The interview was also very well edited and presented overall. And the last point, the P for purpose. The purpose of this interview is to give the world a better idea of what the reality of residential schools was like for the children forced into them. It sheds light onto a voice that is often left unheard. This interview was conducted and shared for one main reason, and that is to educate. The producers of this interview make this intention very clear by making Louise Longclaws and her voice the primary focus of the video. So the first source gave us a glimpse into this issue from a first-person perspective. The second primary source I found is the findings of a survey conducted by the First Nations Information Governance Center. 24,000 people from 253 First Nations communities across Canada were surveyed on their overall quality of life as part of this project, and the results are pretty eye-opening. The part of this that is of particular interest to this topic is what the survey found about residential school survivors and their families. It found that residential school survivors, as well as their children, were less likely to report good health conditions compared to those unaffected by residential schools. In addition, the same group of people reported higher rates of suicidal thoughts, binge drinking, and drug abuse. To put it into numbers, 25% of teenagers on reserve with a family member who had attended residential school had considered suicide. Suicidal thoughts were significantly less apparent among the population of teenagers who didn't have a family member attend, sitting at around 10%. It's interesting how, in all these reported stats, residential school survivors and their family members were grouped into the same categories. And I just think that this proves further how trauma from residential schools carry over intergenerational traits from one generation to the next. Now, on to the next portion of this presentation, which is the secondary sources. My first secondary source is a collection of statistics published by Reconciliation Canada. These statistics are made of facts about residential schools, and there are quite a few of them. I'll just share a few. For example, it shares that a 40 to 60% mortality rate was evident in residential schools, and that 90 to 100% of children at these institutes were either physically, emotionally, or sexually abused. I feel as though this is a valuable source to help guide my research because it provides lots of concrete information on the very nature of residential schools, which is a good basis for building off of. It provides the information needed to initialize a study on intergenerational trauma as a result of residential schools. My second secondary source is a news article from The Spectator that I found through the Gale Research Database. It talks about how the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops is setting out to raise $30 million to help heal residential school survivor trauma. This is a peer-reviewed article from a well-established academic background and reports of a step that Catholic bishops are taking towards reconciliation with Canada's Indigenous communities. It explores what the relationship between the Catholic churches and Indigenous peoples could look like moving forward, which is extremely relevant to my research topic. My final secondary source is a documentary series called Runs Through Their Blood, A Life Impacted. I wasn't able to access the documentaries themselves, but I did look through the trailer, and it works to share some of the intergenerational effects that the residential school system had on Indigenous communities in Canada. It shares untold stories and personal recounts of survivors that are at risk of being lost in time. Now, this is a collection of only a few of the endless resources that help to answer my guiding question. I hope to continue developing this study and to keep up my self-education on the topic of intergenerational trauma amongst Indigenous communities. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. A written recount of all this information can be found in the description of this video, so please take a look there for more info.